my good boy.
Alright, so when I first played Subnautica, I saw the basic reasoning for every power source. Solar is objectively the best for early game, and even some late game bases, depending on how much gold you have. Thermal is basically applicable anywhere in late game, and if all else fails, then screw it, build yourself a mini Chernobyl and have at it. All of these make complete sense and have their respective uses. Other than the bioreactor. It's always seemed so inconvenient as opposed to solar power or thermal, and I thought that if you really had no other options, then you could just use nuclear power. But recently, I decided that in my pursuit of a base that I never have to leave to achieve peak laziness, I'm going to try to figure out the best way to power your base with a bioreactor, and see how that compares to nuclear, thermal, or solar. Now, what is a bioreactor and how does it work? First off, I feel it necessary to briefly explain how a bioreactor works, since I feel like not many of us will have actually used one in our first playthrough of Subnautica. Basically, unlike nuclear power, it works off of a theoretically infinitely renewable material that you could theoretically just grow in your base. That being fish or the eggs of fish. Or any biological material for that matter. Hell, you could chuck kelp in this thing all day, and theoretically, with enough kelp, you might be able to keep it going for some time. How it works is similar in other aspects to a nuclear reactor. You stuff in the fish or biological material, it gets juiced, and you get power. End of story. Larger animals give you more power, and the general hierarchy is that fully formed fish give more power than fish eggs or smaller fish, and most fish give more power than flora, because don't forget you can put any organic matter into this thing, from alien feces to blood kelp pustules to fish and fish eggs. The only things that can be put in the bioreactor are cuttlefish, you monster, and the spiked horngrass, for some reason. Bioreactors also require a multi-purpose room to be placed in, like a nuclear reactor, and the fragments for bioreactors can be found in the grassy plateaus, sparse reef, kelp forest, around certain wrecks, and... oh hell, I'll put a map up on screen, just pause here and look for it if you need it. And it only requires 2 fragments to unlock. Now, on the surface, I think this sounds much more convenient than stringing along power transmitters from some faraway power source, or going out for nuclear fuel every decade or so, and having to deal with the waste. One major downside is that it does only generate 50 power every minute. So it will not even be enough to power one water purification station, which conveniently uses 51 power per minute. So realistically, you can run the lights, if you're lucky, maybe even some chargers, and that's it. So if you want even a moderately large base, then get ready to break out some lube and your oh so precious silver for even a shot at breaking even in a larger base. Quick aside, the solar panel, despite being the literal starting energy generator, provides up to 112 power per minute at day, suck it bioreactor, and even a small amount at night, because reasons. With that said, it can only store 75 power, so as soon as you've got it, you have to put it to use to avoid wasting its generative capacity. This means that realistically, you would run out of power if you had, say, a water filtration station, or really anything like chargers running at night, unless you had multiple solar panels storing that power. The thermal plant, on the other hand, generates this much power. Yup, take it all in. I have no idea who had to compile this, but I'm glad they did. Taking a ballpark estimate, assuming that you'll be using it near a thermal source, that should place it at quite a bit over 50 degrees Celsius. Assuming around 66, which is generally what I found next to any heat source, then that's us about 54.1 power per minute. However, do note that it can generate power at any temperature above 25 degrees, just very little. It should also be noted that it can store up to 250 power, allowing you to run a water filtration station for just under 5 minutes, should the heat stop being hot. But that's the thing. Heat doesn't just stop being hot. This means that the thermal plant is completely passive. Aside from any damage caused by you re-rending it with a sea moth or what have you, the thermal plant will literally never stop producing power, and aside from fluctuating every now and then, and even then not by a lot, it makes the sacrifice of 2 magnetite and 1 aerogel seem pretty reasonable for passive power for life. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum, you've got the nuclear option. Not only does this thing produce the most power per minute out of any other power source, but it can also store a staggering 2,500 power alone. This makes it optimal for any base that doesn't have access to the 2 other, much more convenient and arguably better power sources. Seriously, fight me on this. Passive power generation, it just can't be beat. A major downside is that every time you're around it, you need to wear a radiation suit, which although everyone has, it's just annoying to take on or off and carry around all the time. Also, the nuclear reactor uses up not only your precious silver, but also plasteel ingots, which, although not hard to get, are a pain to get. Now, another important part is that nuclear reactor rods, which are made out of 3 uraninite crystals and some other basic materials, can produce a whopping 20,000 power per rod. And since you have up to 4 at once, this thing can net you up to 80,000 power. So where does this leave the bioreactor? With the competition so heavily stacked and seemingly superior, is there even a use case for it? Well, let's find out. But first, for all of my tests, I'll be doing them for about 3 in-game days, and that will mostly be about an hour since a full day is about 20 minutes in Subnautica. Also, for all of my testing, I've made myself a maximum efficiency Cyclops, a base in the bulb zone, and some tools that someone would realistically have at the point where they're automating their base, because automating your base is definitely pretty late game. Aside from that, I also maxed out the depth on the Seamoth, but I didn't yet make a prawn suit, so that I have the faster option available. And I also didn't take any charging tools like swim charge fins or the solar or thermal charging module for the Cyclops or Seamoth. Oh god, this is gonna take a while, isn't it? Alright, well, let me start by introducing the first option then. Option 1. Finding eggs and just using them for power. Now this actually brings up 2 more strategies, using just eggs or waiting for them to grow and then using the fish for more power. Now this seems like a no-brainer, right? I said myself that fish provide more power, but they also need to hatch, which takes 2 to 3 in-game days, leaving you sitting on your ass for 3 days with no power. So let's put option A1 to the test for 3 days. And this time I will only gather power using eggs which I find. And I am allowed to use a scanner room because, come on, who doesn't have a scanner? If not for this use case, then at the very least for little drones. Also, I will have 1 water filtration station running the whole time because that's the maximum-ish output of 2 bioreactors. Note that I say 2 here. Just keep that in mind. Make sure to put a title card here. While I was fully committed to going up to an hour looking for eggs, honestly, after about 30 minutes of scavenging, I had built up a pretty damn sizable buffer, and so, did this mean I could perhaps take the time to go looking for resources? Maybe build another base? Establish a colony? No, not at all. Yes, it is cool that after just a little bit I had a large buffer, but it is so annoying to have to replenish the eggs every 3 seconds because they barely provide any power while you're off doing much more important things. Side note, if you're ever doing this, never collect large eggs. Like 3x3s? No, not at all. Never. Just stick to small eggs as much as possible. Small eggs provide less power, sure, but they also take up 1/4 the space. And unless you have a prawn suit or Cyclops, and even in a Cyclops, like, do you really want to fill all your chests with eggs? You won't be able to collect many large eggs in your inventory. Anyway, since I was in the bulb zone, I purposefully chose because it was far from sunlight and pretty far from thermal and nuclear, I had to resort to the eggs that were in and around the bulb zone. And that was mainly shocker eggs, which give 259 power, bone shark eggs, which give 210, and jelly ray eggs, which give a measly 119 power. So should you use eggs? Well, in a pinch it worked perfectly fine. Let's not get it twisted. But if you do, then read up on the wiki and find some of the best eggs that you can go for depending on the biome you are in. For example, the whole reason that I was even inspired to make this video all the way back like, I don't know, 3-4 years ago? God, our schedule sucks. Was because of the sheer amount of mesmer eggs that I would find all over the Ghost River. But now that I look at them, they only give about 175 power. But to be fair, they also only take up 1 slot as opposed to jelly ray eggs. So they are much more efficient than hauling around those 2x2 eggs. So far, I'll give using eggs just a 1 out of 10. It'll work in a pinch, but you should try out something even slightly more efficient and a little less grueling or time-consuming. It also allotted very little time to actually go out and leave your base to scavenge, since your power does tick down in your absence, so it's very possible to come back to a base that's run out of power and hasn't been recharging your vehicles or filtering water. Oh, and notice how I mentioned, hey, remember that I said 2 bioreactors? Well, that's because originally I was only going to use 1. But then it was so garbage. 1 bioreactor provided so little power that I couldn't even use a fabricator because all of the power being made would go straight to water filtration. So I had to take time out of my busy schedule to build a second one, which I did in the middle of this run because I had nothing better to do. So, yeah, 1 bioreactor and 1 water filter effectively cancel out, making the base entirely useless. So another good takeaway from this experiment is that bioreactors are only viable in numbers, and alone they are effectively useless for running any serious long-term base. So again, 1 out of 10. Now we're going to try growing the fish, this time again for 3 in-game days since they take about 2 to 3 days to grow, and noting down how well it goes. First of all, I want to point out that I will use my normal unhatched egg strategy to fuel the bioreactor until a fish grows, and yes, that means I have to scavenge for more of those bastard eggs again. So I did. And I also ran into a slightly less expected issue. Eggs in the nearby area started to dwindle, and so I had to expand my search radius, which cut down on my free time to do anything even more. So if I had to say go get blood kelp or aerogel, or go literally any farther than maybe 2 biomes, I would get the emergency power warning. NP screwed upon my return. Now this can be fixed by leaving your area and just, waiting for them to respawn when you leave render distance. And I did that a couple times, I had to. But if you don't plan on leaving your area often, which is kind of the whole point of an autonomous base, then this is unfortunately a potential concern. Anyways, on to the actual strategy itself.
Check in on my good boy.
Overall, it went well. Pretty good. The beginning was really rough because, again, I had to place some eggs to grow and some to be used for power, and when I could use fish for power, I couldn't leave the base for long because only one fish can fit in the bioreactor, as opposed to 4 eggs, which absolutely hamstrung my efficiency. So if one fish gets used up, then poof, power gone. But once enough eggs were growing, it was no longer an issue, and I timed it. The eggs take about 29 minutes to hatch, always. Not some 1 to 3 days crap, it's 29 minutes, give or take like 3 minutes. But once you have a decent rotation schedule, you can mass produce them pretty consistently. I'd give this method like a 4 out of 10, not my preferred way of doing things, and definitely the most annoying since you might get stuck waiting for fish to grow without power. But it definitely worked, and if I spent just a little bit more time in collecting eggs, I mean, it probably would have worked better. It's just, as always, the really rough beginning, but once you're past that, it does become more manageable. There's also, again, and I cannot mention this enough, the major concern of the 1 fish per bioreactor problem, since leaving and going anywhere risks your bioreactor running out of power. Unless you use a large 3x3 fish and then some eggs, or 4 smaller 2x2 fish like mesmers, and having to like portion out which fish go where so that you get the maximum efficiency. I mean, no, it sucks. Across the board. 4 out of 10 is too generous. Honestly, you know what? Screw you. 3 out of 10. There. Happy? Okay, I personally just thought it would be funny to include this since the devs clearly thought that this would be a useful item in the game, so we have to give it a shot for completionist's sake, right? So having said that, it is a shockingly decent option as long as you aren't planning on using it anywhere aside from just the Sea Treader's Path. Because if you have like a base in the Bulb Zone or the Underwater Islands, or really anywhere more than like 20 feet away from the Sea Treader's Path, then that would just suck. You have to drive all the way across the map for alien crap. It sucks. Which, mind you, I was under the impression that there were just mounds all over the place. I thought I would show up and like my chest would be filled. But I got like 2 chunks. I wasted 15 minutes hauling ass to the opposite side of the map for 2 chunks of alien feces. 2! That's all I got. I visited 4 herds of sea treaders, and they barely drop it, making this not only the most boring, time-consuming, and impractical option by far, but also the one with no real upsides. Actually, no, there was one upside. Out of curiosity, I left 2 bone sharks in the tank together to see if they would breed, because I've never done that before, but apparently it's a thing that can happen. And when I came back, there were 6. I believe they can fill the tank more than that, but I'm not sure, because when I had 6, they just sat there. But this is definitely going to be crucial in option 4, yes, we're doing that many. In comparison, the uranite crystals, though rare, are infinitely less annoying to look for and scarce than alien feces. Now, of course, if you have a base right in the Sea Treader's Path or nearby, extending into, say, the dunes or whatnot, then sure, by all means, go ahead and waste your time looking or scanning for alien crap. But I just see no world in which this is practical. You also have to remember that unlike alien feces, uraninite, which you need 3 of for 1 rod, only takes up 1 inventory slot, and that provides 20,000 power per rod, whereas the alien feces provide 300 power. Keep in mind, this is less than some fish, and even then, it's barely more than some fish eggs. So honestly, it seems like an open and shut case really, at least in this case. The bioreactor is only convenient to use with alien feces if you live right in and around that area. And honestly, maybe not even then. So in conclusion, I'll give this a 0.1 out of 10, and even that 0.1 is only because our scale doesn't go below 0, or into the negatives. The other thing you can put in your bioreactor is flora, like plants and stuff. So I made the logical connection to plant a bunch of plants all around the base, and since bulbo trees and marble melons were the most rich in power, I planted about 4 grow beds of each. Now again, this option has 2 approaches. There's growing plants, which we'll call option 3A, and then there's getting samples of things like bulb bushes or other flora around the map, which conveniently we have an abundance of. Okay, there's some remnants of the old script here, which I'm going to skip over. Yep. Oh, yeah, 420 power output per bulb bush. I feel the need to mention that. That's kind of a lot, considering that it's this easy to get. So let's test these methods out. First we try out 3A, I will grant myself permission to throw about 100 energy worth of plants in there just while I wait for it to grow, and let's try that for 3 days. Damn. That went well. In the beginning I thought, well, I'd be screwed since the plants would be used up quickly, but after 30 minutes of powering the base with marble melons alone, I had only used 4, with 8 in bioreactors and another 52 on standby in the nearby planters. This is because plants have significantly more power per tile than, say, a 3x3 shark, since, sure, you get 800 power or so, but you can't actually put anything else of value in the small side slots. Unless you want to mix and match different crap in the bioreactor, but I didn't want to do that here for the sake of cohesiveness and because I'd lose my mind trying to keep that all in mind. On this note, you also need to remember that these planters grow food, so if you get enough, you can effectively have food and power in the same place. Still, this is a far cry from true autonomy, and it wouldn't work for a base which you plan on visiting once every blue moon or plan on using to charge a ton of batteries or anything that would overpower the supply of plants, but it went pretty well, because keep in mind, marble melons grow in 13 minutes and 20 seconds, so realistically it would be pretty difficult to run out. I mean, if you're hanging around your base and you replenish them relatively frequently, this would be pretty decent for a base that you frequently visit, or use as a stopover point, like to recharge your batteries and vehicles and get some food. Nothing too crazy, of course, but you know, 1 or 2 battery charges won't destroy it. So, this is pretty great for that, but it's still tedious as hell to check in on how much is left, and since it takes up a 2x2 space in your inventory, it makes it really annoying to load up more than 4 or 6 at a time. And if you have more than 2 bioreactors, then you'd have to load up to 12 or more at a time, making it a lot more annoying. However, all in all, really solid, extremely consistent in terms of renewability. I think I don't have much to complain about here. I give this a 6 out of 10. Now let's try actively foraging for plants and see how that goes. Now to be clear, I don't expect this to be viable in the long term, but as long as it's decent in the short term as a quick stopgap solution while you breed fish or hatch eggs, that's a win for me. Therefore, I'll only be carrying this test out for about 30 minutes or 1.5 in-game days, since that's around the time it takes for bubble trees, another potential power source, and in-game food item to grow. Alright, so being in the bulb zone does give me the tiny advantage of forged samples with extremely high energy value, being almost equivalent to that of the marble melon, which we just experimented with. However, while going out to collect these will depend on location, I must say that as a temporary solution, it really isn't that bad. In many other locations, you could just as easily use some creep vine. Okay, definitely not. Fuck me. Never mind, there's still tons of flora in each biome begging to be used for this. If you're in the blood kelp, then look out for blood oil, and if you're in the star areas, then you could go for, say, table coral or mushrooms, and if you're in the Grand Reef, then... Well, if you're in the Reef, then you're shit out of luck, but my suggestion is scout the biomes beforehand, because if you're starting up a new base and you're waiting for stuff to grow, or eggs to hatch, or fish to breed, then consider bringing a large buffer of stuff so you don't have to sit in your sea moth for 10 to 20 minutes waiting for it to finish. I give this like a 3 out of 10 as a permanent power source, but as an emergency power source, I'm gonna say like a 7. It serves its purpose, it works. And it still isn't as bad as collecting eggs, but it's definitely not convenient in the long term.
Did you just call me mommy?
Now we're going to try growing fish indoors, and not as in getting eggs and waiting for them to hatch, no. We're going to be stuffing a bunch of bone sharks and ampeels, which produce 630 and 770 power respectively, in an alien containment facility and waiting for them to reproduce. Now to be clear, I have never tried breeding fish in Subnautica, but in our testing earlier, it seemed to work. Question mark? I don't know, I have no idea how long it'll take, but what I do know is that it maybe, perhaps happens eventually. I don't know, we're gonna give it a shot. Oh, and reason I chose bone sharks and ampeels is because I want to be able to track their growth a little better, and since remembering ampeel tank 1 versus ampeel tank 2 is more cumbersome than just 2 separately, I decided to do it like this. But since ampeels give more power, you can expect to have better results when just using ampeels. Also, side note, using any large creature is actually really ineffective because for those 770 energy, you're taking up a 3x3 area. Whereas the Oculus, the deep sea variant of the Peeper, which spawns in the jelly shroom caves, gives a staggering 630 power in a 1x1 slot. This means that theoretically, you could have upwards of 10,000 units of power in one bioreactor. This is what I would define as the closest thing to self-sufficiency that you can get with a bioreactor. But even then, don't forget, with just one nuclear rod, you get 20,000. And nearly 5 times the production rate per second. And 5 times the storage. So you could realistically run a whole base and up to 4 water purifiers off of just one of those things. Nevertheless, let's give the bioreactor a shot with breeding fish. Alright, so since I already had some fish that had grown, I decided to do this experiment for around 40 minutes. And while seeing how many more would breed, all in all, the answers were pretty helpful. So in the beginning, I took out all but 2 mesmers, and after around 30 minutes, there were 4. Now do keep in mind that it may well take longer, but the data's there, so do with that what you will. The bone sharks, meanwhile, did not reach a breeding cap, as I thought, and there were 8 in a 3-large container after the 40 minutes were up. This happened, by the way, while the egg cap was reached, interestingly enough, because there have been 3 eggs laying there that were trying to hatch since Trial 1B, and they could just never hatch because of the entity amount limits. So either the game bugged or the limits are higher for the breeding cap or, you know, Subnautica reasons. Whichever reason it may be, this trial is extremely solid, since I basically never had any fear of running out. Still, this wasn't as good as plants, which grow faster, provide food, and more energy. And with larger animals, you can't put many in the bioreactor, but it was still a decent strategy if you want to be sadistic and juice any fish you can get your hands on. If you do want to do this and want higher efficiency, I suggest getting 2 or 3 alien containments, which are each around 2 or 3 high, and stuffing it with 2 oculus fish each. These provide the highest energy density and are also, theoretically, able to be packed by the dozens in each bioreactor if you can breed that many. Anyway, 4 out of 10 because although they provide decent power security in allowing me to explore the ground reef and back, but upon returning, the bioreactors were usually bone dry, meaning that if you wanted to go literally anywhere else or make any stops on your trip, then you'd be greeted with the
warning, emergency power only
in the middle of your nice midnight venture, and then you'd have to scramble to juice the nearest fish as soon as you got home. Probably with a full inventory, mind you, so you'd have to empty that out, and basically what I'm saying is that this method shares the same problem as the bioreactor in general. It's just not long-term enough, and it doesn't generate enough power to balance out the effort put into maintaining it. Alright, now time to give up on the bioreactor. Yep, the purpose of this whole video. Now we're just gonna try nuclear power, thermal power, and good old solar power. Oh yeah, suck it, bioreactor. So what I'll do is for option 5A, I'll try nuclear power. For 5B and 5C, I'll be setting up thermal and solar power at any point where I can, and then stringing it along with power transmitters, because that would be the realistic use case in a situation like this. Also, because I hate having free time to live my life, I decided to take into account the amount of time required for getting all the materials needed for the power transmitters, but not the generators, since we didn't take into account the amount of time needed to make the actual bioreactors themselves, only the stuff that supports them. So I've never used nuclear power in Subnautica, because... and I don't trust myself around it. But I shit you not, it took me 3 minutes and 26 seconds from switching to survival to powering the nuclear reactor. Now, of course, building it would take time and resources, but since we aren't counting that for the bioreactor, that doesn't count here either. This would have been by far the easiest and most straightforward trial so far, except for the fact that I'm in the bulb zone, which has very easy access to uraninite. So what's an 8 out of 10 here might be more like a 6 or 4 out of 10 anywhere else, if you don't have direct access to that. Now, of course, 20,000 power is a lot, but it's not true self-sufficiency, so, you know, 8 out of 10 in the bulb zone, maybe something else everywhere else. Oh, and also try not to... the Subnautica map. Thermal power was kind of a letdown, honestly. I expected 2 thermal generators to keep up with a water filtration station, no problem, but I ended up needing 3 just to be in the green, which will be a major consideration if you're picking between what power source fits you best. But considering that that was the only major hurdle, and now your base is fully self-sufficient, I'd say it's more than worth it. Now, aside from that, routing the power might be annoying, but honestly, even the grassy plateaus have thermal geysers, so unless you're in, like, the mushroom forest, then I guess that might be annoying, but even the dunes have large thermal spires that you can use, like you see here, so there's always an option. When it comes to actually building the transmitters, it's also not an issue. The infinitely more annoying part was getting aerogel or scrapping my metal. The gold was honestly pretty easy to get since I had a scanner room, but due to the relative cost of this, even just in transmitters in comparison to nuclear, I'll have to give it a 9 out of 10. And now, last but not least, option 5C, the very last of our testing. Surely, this will go over well. Okay, this sucked. I thought if I stack enough, it'll be able to generate a bit, or maybe if I go up, I'll be fine, and it'll work at a little under max capacity, or hell, maybe I should just go find a slightly higher biome or a mushroom tree and plop them all there. But after going through stacks and stacks of titanium and rebuilding this thing twice, I had my answer. It ain't pretty, and it sure as hell ain't economical, But just feast your eyes upon this. It costs infinity titanium, infinity time, and oh my god, so many brain cells. Despite that, it is still the fastest power generation method we have seen. We have peaked. A 10. A 10 in terms of cost, because who the hell has ever liked titanium? And to an extent copper. A 10 in power generation and expandability, because hell, just stack another corridor and pile them on. And a 10 in location, unless you're underground or in the literal void. Now I'm sure this might not be the preferred method for many, because your base might collapse the second you connect it all together. But if you get it going, the expandability is endless. And again, complete sufficiency. Except for the night, you get absolutely screwed at night. So now, with all of our testing finished and the deadline for this video finally up, it's time to decide. Does the bioreactor have any real value in a base? And I think the answer is pretty cut and dry. No, what do you mean? It really doesn't. What? In what universe? Now, of course, feel free to disagree with me. I've only done a week of research and 10 hours of testing, but I'd love to hear your wrong opinions. No, but seriously, throughout my testing, the bioreactor has never seemed like a solid long-term option. Only a stopgap solution at most, and a really damn tedious one at that. I get the point of having it in the game because some people like making themselves busy. It says busy here in the script. I think it meant suffer. And living life teetering on the edge of an emergency power warning. But that's just not me, and I doubt it's a common thing in general. Now, using the bioreactor to add a challenge to your game is one thing, but the problem is that using it isn't particularly challenging. It just becomes a chore after one too many egg hunts or pilgrimages to the Sea Treader Path. Not only that, but the alternatives are just infinitely more useful. Even the solar panels, I would rather set that up because at least it's a one and done. You set it up and boom, your base will never run out of power, at least for the foreseeable future. And nuclear, if you really want a ton of power and are in a remote place, just set one of those up. 80,000 is more than enough for literally any base, let alone a temporary remote hideaway of some sort. It could even power a full-time base, provided you get some uraninite every now and then. Even thermal, which is crucial in the endgame, worked so much better than the bioreactors ever did, and again, full self-sufficiency. You just build them and power them up, and you're done. In conclusion, I believe that the bioreactor is a pointless, needlessly weak power generator, and also, I don't know if you noticed this, but see how I cap out at 500 each time? That's because despite producing more than a water filter takes up, this only allows one bioreactor to be full, and the other one constantly has to be empty because for some reason, it doesn't have the brain capacity to share the load. Unlike us, we here at the Info Vault always share our load. Of new garbage videos, that is, about once a year or whenever we get bored, I guess. So if you want to check that out, then, yeah, maybe don't go back that far. But some of these are pretty alright. Don't count on consistently uploading, but, you know, count on something eventually. Probably when we get bored or feel guilty again anyway. Anyway, until next time, see ya.